we doing? Good. My name's Michael. I'm from the church down at El Dorado Hills, and I know some of you people, but some of you are new, and I'm very excited about that. It's good to see some new faces up here. God is doing some amazing work through this community. I'm excited to see what continues to happen. But by way of getting started, we're going to be flying through a massive chunk of text today because somebody had a birthday last weekend. You guys. So yeah, congrats, Fosterville 1 year. Okay, you're like, what's he referring to? Okay, we're here. We got this, all right? So we're going to be flying through a little bit to catch up. But by way of getting started, how many of you guys are parents in the room? Have been parents? Know a parent? Okay, everybody? Great. We got everybody on that one. Listen, nothing has taught me more about my sin than becoming a parent. And what I mean by that is, I'm terrible at patience. There's something about the 3-year-old spirit that is just unbreakable, unyielding in the face of instruction. I'm not really sure where that comes from. It can't be me. It's got to be my wife, right? No, somebody told me the other day, they're like, yeah, we can tell you're her dad. Okay, thanks. My daughter's the cutest little thing, little redhead. She's 3 and really tall. And she just like rips through everything. And she thinks she is the mayor of whatever town we're in. Some of that is probably because she got overly desensitized to social gatherings by being a pastor's kid. But we were at like Apple Hill yesterday, and she was going up, introducing herself to everybody at the restaurant. Hi, I'm Addie. Hi, I'm Addie. And I'm like, sweetie, we don't have to do that here. That's a church people thing, okay? We don't. And it's really hard to undo that kind of stuff. But sometimes I find myself as a parent, when we get into these situations that are a little uncomfortable or frustrating, I find myself wanting to react instead of respond. You guys been there? When you know what it means to react. When you react, it's like a guttural response. It's something that isn't planned. It's something that's instantaneous. It's something that we often regret after we do it. That's what happens when we react. Now, what we know is what's more important than reacting would be responding, right? And the difference there would be responding would be actually pausing, considering an action, actively listening, doing things that actually align with our core values, not just the whatever we've picked up in our life at the moment. And sometimes what happens in life is we go through life just kind of reacting to things. We react to a really frustrating email at work, or we react to an unexpected bill in the mail, a social media post, a bad call in a youth sports game. I don't know if okay, that was too close to home for somebody in here today. That's okay. But we react sometimes instead of responding. And there's a real problem with that because it kind of goes against what it is that God's trying to produce in us. Like, as followers of Jesus, we're not called to just be reactionary to things. We're called to learn how to respond how Jesus would respond. It's part of what happens when we become a Christian is the character of Christ slowly begins to be formed in us. And that looks different than just reacting. That looks like responding differently. And that's something that actually is modeled in who Jesus is. And today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 really big responses to Jesus, reactions to Jesus, 2 approaches to Jesus. And what we're doing in Matthew in these first 4 chapters is all these people we're talking about. I mean, you guys heard a lot of names over the last 4 weeks. Zerubbabel, somebody, okay? You've heard a lot of names. You're like, what is the point of all this? Here's the point. They're all witnesses to God's work. That's what they do. They're all witnesses. And everything leading up to 4 is Matthew systematically going through saying, look, this person was a witness. This person was a witness. This one, the wise men are witnesses. Herod was a witness. Joseph and Mary was a witness. Satan becomes a witness. As the temptation unfolds, the crowds become witnesses. The disciples are witnesses to the work of God. They all saw what God was up to and what God was doing, but all of them respond differently. All of them react differently. And there's really 2 different kinds of approaches that I want to present to us today as we walk through what's happening in this text. Is we can look at Jesus and who he is and what he does, the way that he works in our lives, and we can either react to him or we can respond to him. This is the dichotomy we're going to lay before us. And what my hope for you and my encouragement for you would be this, is as we talk about this narrative of how Jesus was born and the wise men showing up and what Herod does in response to it, that you'd be looking for ways that maybe you react or respond to the work of God in your own life. Because God is constantly working in all of our lives. He's always up to something. But if you're anything like me, sometimes I react more than I respond to God. Something blows up in my face. God, why? God, what are you doing? I respond with reaction instead of thinking through, okay, God, what are you up to? What are you inviting me into? What is your purpose behind this? And so that's my challenge for you guys today. And typically what we do is we'll read the whole text before we get into it. We're not doing that today because we'd be sitting here for 20 verses and a third of you would fall asleep. And that's okay because you'll still be in heaven, I hope. But I'm not going to do that to any of you. We're going to get in right to the text. So here we are, Matthew chapter 2. You can turn there in your Bible. But here's what it says. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we have come to worship him. This is it. This is the moment. Jesus is finally born. He's here, and he's in this little town called Bethlehem. And there's a really interesting group of people that know about this. They're called the wise men. Now, I don't want to blow up anybody's nativity, but there probably weren't 3 of them. There's probably a lot of them. A lot of us think there were 3 because there were 3 gifts, but there's probably a whole group of these dudes, and we know very little about them. They're from the East. That's about all we got. They're probably into astrology, like some people in this town. They were looking for signs in the stars and things to give hints about stuff, and they see some like crazy thing happening in the West, and so they come from the East to the West. We tracking? So they have some sort of signal, like something's going to happen, and then something was communicated to them through whatever they were trying to divine, and they realize that this being that was born is a king. He's a king of these people called the Jews, and their intention was to worship him. Now that's a beautiful intention, but here's the problem. Jesus wasn't really king yet as far as the present king was concerned. His name was Herod, and so Herod had a problem with this. It says, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, as you would be. He's a king. Kings gotta be kings. That's what they do, right? And they do whatever they can do to stay king. Herod was no different. Herod is what you would consider like a puppet king. So the way he functioned is the Roman government had taken over this colony, and they had put in place different leaders. And there was this group of people that had started to lead who were Jewish, but they were siding with the Romans. Herod was one of those people who was a king. But Herod was known for being ruthless. He murdered multiple family members trying to stay king. He was driven by maintaining and controlling power. So you can imagine him hearing that some other king has been born would be a problem for him. And so what he does is he collects all the different priests and scribes, the best and brightest people he could gather, and he says, where's the Christ? Where is this Messiah that they're talking about being born? And so the people that he gathered together tell him, they say, this is the prophecy that in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people. The priests and the scribes affirm it. They say, yeah, this is something God promised. This is in his word. What's happening is all a part of God's plan. And this prophecy is beautiful because it highlights a very small town that really wouldn't have made most people's lists as top 10 places to visit in Israel. It wouldn't have been a really sought after community. But this little town called Bethlehem was actually really significant. It was the birthplace of King David, which was one of the kings of Israel, one that they've thought of as like the greatest king of their time, King David. It's also the place that a little love story in the Bible happens. Y'all know Ruth and Boaz? Yeah, that's a beautiful one. Okay, so go pull it open or attend a women's retreat sometime and you'll hear about it. Ruth and Boaz, I'm sorry, was that too? That was a little, okay, well, I'll put that, let's see if I can put that back in the toothpaste tube. Okay. Ruth is a beautiful story, and what it has is this picture of this woman who like is faithful to God even when she didn't have to, and this man named Boaz who's also faithful to God, and God brings them together, and it's from Ruth and Boaz that the line of David comes. Bethlehem is significant for that reason. It's also the burial place of a woman named Rachel, who we're going way back in the Old Testament. That's who Jacob was in love with, but he got pranked by her dad and had to marry her other sister. Weird story, go open Genesis and you'll have a good time. Here's the point. Bethlehem shouldn't have made the map, shouldn't have been significant, but God chose it. And in Micah 5:2, that's where this prophecy comes from. It says, this is the town that's going to be important. This is the town where it says, the ruler of my shepherd, or the ruler who will shepherd my people Israel will come from. You see, Jesus' role as king was a little bit different than what most kings would be. Now, it was common to use the concept of a shepherd when people talked about a ruler. But here, the notion of being a shepherd is way more elevated. In fact, Jesus often is referred to that. In Psalm 23, David prays to the Lord as his good shepherd, the one who would guide him, who would lead him by still waters, who would walk him through the shadow of the valley of death, who would prepare a table before him in the presence of his enemies, who would anoint his head with oil. This is the kind of good shepherd Jesus would be. He says, this ruler that's going to come is going to be a shepherd of my people, Israel. Herod was not a shepherd. Herod was not a good king. Herod was not leading people by still waters or taking them through the valley of death. Jesus was coming to be an opposite to what Herod was. He's like a foil to Herod. And so Herod finds out that this is actually a prophecy from the Bible, and he has the wherewithal to recognize that God follows through on his promises. And so Herod comes up with a scheme. It says that Herod summoned the wise men secretly in his chambers and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. He said, where did this thing come from? When did it show up? And then he sent them to that town, to Bethlehem, and he says, go and search for the child and just feel this dripping with spidery intent. Like, go and search diligently for the child. And when you found him, bring me word so I can worship him too. Unlikely, okay? He's not going to go worship a baby. He has very ill intentions. He says, listen, guys, come on. I really want to worship him too. Thanks for letting me know that I'm not king anymore. No, Herod, this isn't his intention whatsoever. He lies to them, but he sends them on their way, which probably meant that they had some mode of protection on their journey, some way of getting to where Jesus was, so that it was ensured that they would make it there to worship this king, so that Herod could find out where exactly he was. And so after listening to the king, the wise men go on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. Now, we don't really know, what exactly that star looked like, how exactly that star worked. Like, was it kind of like the little fairy from Zelda where, hey, listen, telling him where to go? We don't know. It's kind of confusing to say, how did it work? But somehow God worked through the sky to have this thing that they followed that was bright and that they knew signified the birth of someone significant. Often that was something that was thought of in the ancient Near East, that there would be some sign in the sky when a king is born. So this is a concept they would have been familiar with. And so when they saw the star where it rested, here's what they do. They rejoice exceedingly with great joy. They're filled with joy. That's kind of interesting. Why are they filled with joy? You see, I think the wise men had some insight that other people didn't. They knew that there was something special about this baby. They knew something was going to happen. And it says that they began to worship. They're rejoicing exceedingly with great joy. Here we see that Jesus is the first and most important source of joy, source of real, enduring happiness in the face of difficult circumstances, exceedingly rejoicing with joy. Meaning it's almost like the word here would be superabundant or overflowing with joy is what they felt when they found this child. They were filled with joy. And so what they do is they go into the house and they see Mary with his mother with a child. And then it says this, they fell down and worshiped him. This is the first time we see Jesus worshiped in the Bible in this way. This is crazy. These people had some type of insight. They were looking for something and they found it. What they found was somebody worth worshiping. They fell down and worshiped him. In a lot of ways, I think, and we said it earlier, we think of three gifts. There's the gold, the frankincense, and myrrh, but I almost like to think of it like there's four gifts. This is the fourth one. They're giving the gift of their worship. They're like, you are deserving of this. You're deserving of us bowing down before you and worshiping you. So what happens is they open their treasures and they offer him gifts. And these are kind of weird gifts. If you guys know anybody who's expecting, don't bring 2 out of the 3 to the baby shower. Gold would be kind of cool, but the other 2 would be weird. Here's what they bring: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The gold was to represent that he would be some type of divine ruler. It was to signify that he was important, that he would be full of resource. It was saying, hey, this is the king. And then frankincense is kind of a weird thing. I mean, if you've ever been to a candle store, you kind of could get a vibe for what frankincense is, but it's this aroma that would come from burning incense, and it was used in worship. It was used to kind of commune with God. And what that signified was Jesus was going to be the way in which we communed with God. He was going to be the thing that helped us get to him and him come to us. It's the point of the frankincense. And then the myrrh is also, that's the weirdest one. This is an embalming tool. It was something it was embalming substance. It was something used to preserve dead bodies when they would go and bury them. That's not something you'd think would be given at a baby shower, but this is something that they brought for him. They bring him myrrh because they had some sort of insight as to what this child was going to do. They knew one day that he would die a death that none of us could do, that he would pay a price that none of us could pay for. And they give him this gift of myrrh, which signifies what Jesus would ultimately do for us on the cross. It's fascinating to me that this even happened this way. Like, how did they know? How did they get this insight? Like, what was God doing? But what God consistently seems to do, especially in the Gospels, is the people who get it aren't the people we think would get it. And the people who don't get it are the people we would hope would have got it. This is going to show up all over the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus starts preaching. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Those aren't the people we think were blessed. Blessed are the meek. That's not who you'd think is blessed. Blessed are the persecuted. Wait, they're the ones who are blessed? It's this upside down concept, this upside down kingdom. And right here, these people who are the least likely to get it, got it and understood on a deep level what Jesus was going to do. Really, you could think of this almost like a coronation moment. And did you guys see when they coronated the king recently? They made a bunch of hoopla. I know as good Americans, we don't watch that kind of stuff, but there's this like huge event and a lot of to do, and there's wealth and there's this crown, and then they bring all the people out, and all the lords and the earls have to be there, right? And they're there to witness this thing. This is like a coronation moment for Jesus. They're crowning him king. They're saying the king has been born. This is a way of crowning him and worshiping him. And you guys, what I want to point out is this is the response to Jesus. This is it. They're responding in worship. This is all that God requires of us. He says, fall down and worship me. Put me first. Let me sit on the throne of your heart instead of all the things that you put up there throughout the week and throughout your life. Let me be number one. Let me be in charge. This is what God wants and God desires from us, is that we would fall down and we would worship him. Guys, this is a model for us of what it looks like to worship God. And what's important to recognize is what worship isn't and what worship is. Okay, so as much as we love Zach and the band, worship is not a song. We know this. It's not just a song. Worship is not just a communion or a sacrament or a sermon. Worship is not just these things. It can be those things, but it's not just those things. What worship is the constant, unending outpour of all that we are and all that we have. We are constantly worshiping things. We are constantly pouring out who we are to things. Could be our kids, could be our career, could be our future, could be our relationships. We're constantly pouring out. And that's a modality of worship. But what worship is when it comes to God is it's the constant outpour and overflow of everything that we are, all that we have for him. That's what worship is. And that can happen in a song. That can happen in a sermon. That can happen when you're at the Grand Canyon and you are awestruck with how incredible God is for making something like that. It can happen when you're holding a newborn child and you're awestruck at how beautiful God is for the way that he creates. Worship can happen almost more powerfully in moments like that. And it's when we turn our attention and our affection to God. That's when we start to worship. But really the rhythm of the Christian life is continuing to turn our attention and affection, to repent from sin, to turn to Christ, to direct our hearts and our minds toward him, knowing that he's the true source of our joy. For they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. They had recognized who was worthy of worship. So this is the first model of what it looks like to approach Jesus. They approach him by responding in worship, but Herod has a different intention and an entirely different reaction to Jesus. This is Herod's plot. Now, when they had departed, meaning the wise men stayed there, we don't know how long. We don't know how long it took for them to get there, which means maybe Jesus was a little bit older than a baby at that point. I don't want to blow up everybody's nativity, but the text shows us that they stayed and hung out for a bit. And then here's what happens. They leave, and then an angel appears to Joseph in a dream. Joseph is what we would call lucky in our modern day terms. God keeps speaking to him through dreams. When he was about to divorce Mary, God speaks to him through a dream. When this guy named Herod is about to destroy the child, God speaks to him through a dream. He says, rise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there. For I tell you, Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. You see, Herod had killed before. This wouldn't have been weird for him. He's not above assassinating to keep himself in power and to keep himself king. He was not above assassinating a child to maintain his power, to maintain his rule. And so Joseph hears this command from the angel in the dream, and he goes. It says he rose, he took the child and his mother at night, and they departed to Egypt. They remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I call my son. You see, what Matthew's doing and what happened is he's showing us that Jesus is really like a new kind of Moses. This is like a new Exodus. If you guys are familiar with the Exodus story, the people of Israel were in bondage in Egypt. They were slaves, and they were building all kinds of things, and they were being poorly treated, and Pharaoh had killed many of their people brutally because of them growing in size. And God moved through this man named Moses to rescue his people from Egypt. It's one of the most significant events for Jewish people, the way they celebrate it year after year after year. It's also one of the most significant events for us as Christians. Like the Exodus is God's model for how he rescues and saves. It shows us who God is, what God is about, and how God moves. And in the same way, what's happening with Jesus is he's going to become a type of Moses, but he's going to be a better version of Moses. See, Moses was limited in what he could do. Moses ended up actually ending in failure. He got to a point where he reacted instead of responding. He struck a rock, and God chose not to let him into the promised land to receive that final moment that the whole Exodus was kind of for. But Jesus comes and he does what Moses couldn't. He leads his people out of slavery and into freedom. That's what Jesus does in our lives. That's what he does in our hearts. He takes us from the slavery and the bondage of sin and leads us to the freedom of grace and the freedom of new life in him. This is a picture of that. It says you're going to go to Egypt. And it was to fulfill this. Out of Egypt I call my son, meaning this was something that was actually prophesied to happen. I want you to notice that a lot of things in this text as we're going through it, there's just a fulfillment after fulfillment after fulfillment. Here's another one. It's from Deuteronomy, where it talks about Yahweh saying, I will raise up a prophet like Moses that will say the words of God from his own mouth. Matthew's trying to get us to think of Moses here. And then here's what happens is Herod, in the same way that Jesus is experiencing this new Exodus, Herod becomes a new type of Pharaoh. Here's what happens. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under. This is horrible. And no, this doesn't show up in most Christmas scenes. But this is what happened. Herod was so evil and so consumed with control that he said, I just need to wipe out any child that could ever remotely be this king that's supposed to have been born. Now, scholars kind of debate how many kids that might have actually been. It may have been anywhere from a few dozen to 100 or so. It's somewhere in that range. No matter what the number is, it's heinous what happened. It's evil what happened. And what's sad about Herod and really humanity in itself, as this becomes a foil or a picture of who we are in some ways, what's sad about Herod is he does whatever it takes to stay king. And in a lot of ways for us, we do whatever it takes to stay in control, to still call the shots in our own lives. And this is what happens when we're kings of our own life. It leads to death. It leads to destruction. This is what happens when we try to stay king. But when Jesus comes and he says he's the new king and he offers us to live in his kingdom, he's offering us to stop having to pretend to be in control, to not have to pretend to run things or to be in charge. We can come and actually submit to him and let him run our lives. Jesus is the better king, better than Herod, better than any of us could do with our own lives. But he comes and he shows us that. And this thing that happened was very real and very raw for the people who experienced it. In fact, there's a prophecy that Matthew references next where he says, then it was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice heard in Ramah weeping and a loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted, for they are no more. What I don't want to miss here is this isn't just like a little Bible story that like lives in some fantasy land. This is a real thing that happened. These things from the Bible are real stories that really happened to real people. And what I love that Matthew is doing here is he doesn't just kind of skip over that event. He actually pauses for a second and highlights the depth of the grieving that would have happened at something like this. And it's hard to imagine what that would have been like. I mean, he's referencing Jeremiah 31:15, and it talks about Rachel's weeping, which, remember, that's Jacob's preferred wife. It's the picture of like who Israel was. And there's this promise that God would bring Israel back from exile and turn mourning into joy. The rest of 31 gets us to that point. But here in 31:15, it highlights this. Now, it may not, we'll debate later. Zach, you can tell me later if this was worth it. But what I want to do for just a second is talk a little bit about the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. Because if you're anything like me, you've asked that question before. And then when you come to a text like this, you sometimes wonder, God, what were you up to? Like, you rescued Joseph and Mary and Jesus, but what about everybody else? And why not everybody else? Why does God save some and not all? And it leaves us wondering sometimes, well, why does God do that? Remember that this is a thing that really happened. And for the people that experienced this was a massive setback in their life. But what we know is true about setbacks is they're oftentimes set-ups for something that God is up to in our lives. You see, when it comes to evil, it's a question for many of us because it's something we've all experienced. It's also something we have to admit that we contribute to. Like, our own sin perpetuates evil in this world. But we also have experienced evil done to us. And so the problem of evil isn't an external thing, meaning, there's all these people who are doing bad things. It's internal as well. It's a both and. And it leaves the question of, okay, what is God up to? And when you think about evil, it's not hard to develop like a logical answer for it. It's like, okay, there could be logical reasons for it or how it could work. And the real problem with evil is the emotional problem of evil. Logically, things can easily start to make sense, but emotionally, it's hard to reconcile what we've experienced or what we've seen happen. But what's beautiful about the Christian life and what's beautiful about the way that God addresses the issue of evil is we're caught up in this massive story. The whole world, the whole cosmos is caught up in this massive sweeping story that moves from creation to the fall to redemption. There's this arc of human history. And where we're caught in a time-bound sense is we're caught in this moment of not having yet realized what God has completely been up to. We're stuck in the middle of seeing evil, experiencing evil, contributing to evil. But what we know is true about what God is going to do is that God is going to ultimately and finally deal with evil. It will be done. It will be over. There will be no more evil. There will be no more tears or crying or suffering or the like because of what God will ultimately do. But sometimes we look at what's happening in the in-between and we think God isn't active or God isn't moving, that God's not up to something. There's this like myth of God's apparent inaction, but the reality is that God is actually actively working against evil. He actively worked against evil on the cross, which is important to recognize. Part of how he dealt with the punishment that was deserved for sin and death is through what happened to Jesus on the cross. That is a mode of dealing with it. But he doesn't just deal with it in the cross, he also deals with it in the end times. When Jesus comes back, it's over for evil. Evil is done. He actively works against it. He also acts against evil through special revelation, meaning God gave us his word to teach us what life in the kingdom looks like, and that is a way to combat evil in our world. God said, hey, here's the mode for how to do this. He didn't just give us like words for it, but then he also acts against evil with the kingdom. So when Jesus comes, he says, hey, I've come to announce a kingdom. He means I've come to announce a new way of life that you join in with and you're a part of, and then you are actively working against the forces of evil in this world through God. You see, part of the solution to evil is you. Part of the solution to evil is God. Part of the solution to evil is Jesus. Are we tracking? And so what happens sometimes, we get stuck in this kind of in-between, but what's important to recognize is we are a part of a redemptive story. And part of what God's kingdom is doing as we jump into this kingdom is we become a part of God's redemptive work in fixing what's wrong with the world. In fact, one of the things that one theologian talks about is how forgiveness is a tool for breaking the power of evil. Forgiveness can break this chain reaction of evil in our lives and the lives of those around us. Forgiveness is huge for that. And in fact, God, when Jesus teaches them how to pray, he says, pray to deliver yourself from evil. In Matthew 6, he says, pray for that. It's not something that we don't do anything about or we just allow to happen. It's something God asks us to be active in. And when you think about this, maybe it's not like immediately satisfying. Like, wait, so you're telling me like God's going to deal with it and now we're just stuck in the middle, or I get to be a part of it, but what do I do with it? But what I challenge you with is to consider what the different kind of perspectives on this really are. What about secularism? Just the naturalistic kind of worldview of the world, that everything just kind of is and evolved and became. It went from the goo to the zoo to you, and now here we are, and evil is just a part of death, and there's nothing beyond that. Secularism's answer for evil is survival of the fittest. What about postmodernism? Postmodernism would just say there is no evil. Evil doesn't exist. It's just what your definition of evil is versus my definition of evil. There's this deconstruction of all morality in postmodernism that leaves us with, how do you ever say anything is wrong ever? And how do you ever say anything is good ever if you have nothing wrong? So there's that. Or how about New Age spirituality? If we just kind of transcend what's happening with evil, if we just commune with spirits, like maybe that would get us past it. Buddhism and the like, if they just transcend past evil, withdraw from the world, try to meditate yourself into a state of oneness with the universe. Islam is heavy on fatalism, that evil is because you deserve it. What Christianity comes in and does is I think it offers a better answer to evil than what anything else the world kind of offers when it comes to dealing with this problem. What the Bible teaches us is that humans seem to have some level of agency in the world. We seem to make some types of decisions, and those have consequences to them. But God intended for that to happen. We also see that God is planning to fix everything and has told us how he's going to do it in his word. We also see that God actually does something with evil and suffering that other religions and other mindsets don't do. Like besides the Kanye West, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of concept, that's about as close as we get. What God says is actually the suffering and evil you experience is a part of what makes your soul. Like it forms you, and God uses it to redeem you and to make you more like him, which is crazy that he would even do that. And then if you even take into account like, man, how good God is, and if he's sovereign, and if he's able to balance, somehow there's human choice, somehow there's God's sovereign will, somehow everything's working together, then whatever we are experiencing right now is the best possible world God could have created if he's really God. But these are the things that are presented to us throughout Scripture. And this is what, in a text like this, is important to at least think through, because I believe that Jesus offers us a better answer to everything. Not just what we do with our time or talent or our treasure, not just what we do with our lives, but even the biggest questions, the questions that are really hard to define. They're the little 4-letter words like evil or good, the things that are actually harder to define, that Jesus gives us better answers for. He teaches us what life really looks like. Even in a moment like this, God was up to something. God was moving. God had a plan. And so when Herod finally dies, here's what happens. Jesus receives this dream, or Joseph gets a dream. The Lord appears to him, this angel of the Lord in Egypt, and says, rise and take the child and his mother and go back to the land of Israel, because the one who sought the child's life is dead. God protected Jesus. He withdrew to Egypt. And then he says, now it's time to head back to Israel. Did you guys know Jesus was a refugee? That Jesus had no home? That Jesus lost everything? That Jesus had no place to go? He had to leave. He had to flee his country because someone was trying to kill him, and he had to go and live in Egypt. And then who knows how long he had to live there before he finally comes back to Israel. He's experienced what it's like to be without. Jesus resonates with that. He was forced to live in a foreign land. And then he comes back to Israel, but he doesn't even go back to their home. He doesn't even go back to the town of their father, which was Joseph. His town was Bethlehem. He doesn't go back there. Instead, he goes to a different place. He withdraws to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he was called a Nazarene. Do you guys see how every little piece of this story had intentionality behind it? That every single element, God was up to something. I mean, imagine reading through the Old Testament and just trying to pick up every little verse that said anything about what the Messiah would be. There's a lot of them. And there's a lot of different things that are said. Like, how is he going to be in Bethlehem and Nazareth? And he's also going to, so how does he do that? Well, he's born in Bethlehem. He goes to Egypt. Like, he's supposed to come out of Egypt too. And then he's in Nazareth. Like, can you see what he's up to? But like, this is one thing. Where geographically was Jesus during his early years? Like, this is one little tiny piece of the picture. But the whole thing is something God has been up to. And how intentional is he with your life too? That every step along the way, God's been with you. That every step into your future, God's already there. God already knows where you're going. He already knows what you're going to be up to, and he's there. He's present. He's intentional. This is shown all throughout this narrative that we just unpacked today, but here's where I want to leave you guys is with this question. There's two approaches to Jesus that we can take. We saw it clearly. You've got the wise men who respond, they worship, they fall to their knees, they say, God, oh man, you are God. I want to worship you. I want to give everything to you. And you have Herod, who instead of worship declares war. He declares war against God. He says, no, I'm going to go stamp out everything that you're up to. And he tries to go and kill any hint of what this king could have been. Sometimes we react to what God's up to. Sometimes we reject what God is up to. But I think the heart of this text and really what we're challenged with today is, man, how do we get to a place where we're actually responding to the work of God? And if we're going to respond to the work of God, it's going to take a few things. It's going to take something like humility, like slowing down, like trusting that God's better is better than our better, that God's actually up to something better than we could imagine. It's going to take patience. It's going to take gentleness with other people. Is this sounding like the fruit of the Spirit yet? It's going to take some help. And that help comes from Jesus himself. It comes from the Spirit living in us and producing these things in us. But guys, it is entirely possible to go your whole life just reacting to God and completely miss God. But it's also entirely possible that we could adopt a posture of response to our Lord, to our Savior, and to let him be the king that he really is, because he can do better with our life. He can do better with the biggest questions of this world. He can do better with our futures than we ever could. And so today what we're going to do is, since we've been talking about the Christmas narrative, we're going to sing a song that really is from the Christmas season, but it's a picture of what it means to come to Jesus. We're going to sing, "O Come All Ye Faithful," and really it's a challenge to say, can we just come and lay down whatever we have, whatever we've got to Jesus? Can we respond to Jesus today is the question. So would you stand with me and let's worship Jesus together this morning?